Congress takes a break, we sit down with our representatives on health care.
Keep in mind that this is still an increase in Medicaid spending.
Those are, people say unintended consequences. They're consequences everybody knew about.
Plus, what they want to see in a NAFTA renegotiation.
Environmental protections that are enforceable.
We've got to maintain the benefits that we've had so far.
And more. This is Metro Week. Hi, I'm Andrea Kelly. Thanks for joining us. This week, we caught up with our Southern Arizona representatives in Congress, Republican Martha McSally and Democrat Raul Grijalva. We talked healthcare and much more. We'll dive right in after a look at the week's top stories from the Arizona Public Media Newsroom.
The Pima Animal Care Center no longer provides services to residents of Marana and Sahuarita. Earlier this year, Marana and Sahuarita opted out of their contracts with Pima County for animal care. In the meantime, both towns have set up their own services to handle animal bites, noise and waste complaints, rabies, and dogs licenses. They've also contracted the Humane Society of Southern Arizona to house their community's homeless pets. Last month was the hottest June in Tucson's history, according to the National Weather Service. The average temperature in Tucson last month was nearly 90 degrees. That's the hottest monthly average measured in June and the 7th hottest month on record. The warm weather carried over into July with a streak of 18 consecutive days with a daily high of 105 or more, the third longest streak ever. The Red Cross is asking for help to solve a blood shortage in southern Arizona. Officials are calling the current shortage a blood drought. They say southern Arizona is 61,000 pints short of where it needs to be. The Red Cross says the shortage has not yet caused surgeries to be canceled. All blood types are needed, though the biggest needs are for O positive and negative, A negative, and B negative. Tucson's Museum of Contemporary Art is accepting applications for its relaunched Artist in Residence program. Applications are open to all artists at any stage in their career and includes a place to live, a stipend, and an exhibition. For more on all of the week's top stories, you can always visit our website. That address, news.azpm.org.
Healthcare seems to be the main item on the congressional agenda right now, and yet it's stalled. It's also unclear to many of us what the proposed changes will mean. I asked our Southern Arizona representatives to share their thoughts. We start with Congresswoman McSally. The Congressional Budget Office estimated that the Senate health bill, as it stands right now, would have a $772 billion savings in Medicaid, which of course we can reverse out to say $772 billion not spent on Medicaid means people not getting that care. So where will those people get care? And I know the numbers are a little different in the House bill you voted on, but just kind of going forward, where will those people who might lose Medicaid get care?
Well, let me first say that this is still a work in progress. There's deliberations that are ongoing. The House started the process. The Senate is continuing on in the process. So we do not have a final Senate version of the bill. Keep in mind that this is still an increase in Medicaid spending. It's a decrease in the rate of increase of spending. And so Medicaid spending will still go up in real dollars in either of these bills over the next 10 years. It's just got some initiatives in there for traditional Medicaid, trying to have other states, quite frankly, model states like Arizona for traditional Medicaid. Arizona is one of the better models. We have managed care. We don't focus on fee-for-service, which other states that are focused on that are sometimes getting 60–70% paid for by the federal government, and they don't have the same model as Arizona. So there is an opportunity through some of the initiatives that are being discussed to have other states have to take on models like Arizona's in order to be more efficient and more effective in how they're delivering care to traditional Medicaid recipients, the elderly, the aged, the disabled, children. That's traditional Medicaid. There's another discussion and debate about how we go forward on the Medicaid expansion. The Affordable Care Act honestly had sort of a distorted motivation for states to expand their Medicaid to the childless adults, able-bodied adults, up to 138% of the poverty. And some states expanded and some states didn't. Arizona did. They said they'd spend 100% federal dollars to start with, and then it would go down to 90% over time. But think about that. Each state has a different formula about the federal-state balance of funding for Medicaid. So for Arizona, it's about 67% federal dollars. For traditional, like severely disabled on Medicaid, federal government spends 67 cents on the dollar. But for able-bodied adults, the investment was 100% going down to 90. So that's not sustainable. That was sort of a distorted trying to motivate states to expand Medicaid because it was financially in their interest to do so. And now we have a mismatch of expansion states and non-expansion states across the country, and we can't sustain like this for the long haul. So as we've been in this conversation about how we address this, I've been spending a lot of time talking to the governor with his healthcare experts. Whether you agreed or disagreed with whether Arizona should have expanded Medicaid, we did. And we now have about 400,000 people through the expansion that are getting their health care through Medicaid right now. So we owe it to our constituents, to our community, to make sure that there is if there's going to be a transition back to what is traditional Medicaid, that there is a off-ramp and an opportunity for them to get the health care that they need as it transitions. So I have been advocating tirelessly through this process to make sure that we are responsible as we transition, as we're coordinating to sort of address those issues that are the differences between the different states. If the Medicaid expansion is going to be phased out, that it is a very long off-ramp, that it provides the opportunity for the individual market to become strengthened, that it provides the opportunity for states, community health centers, and others to make sure that the safety net is there for them, and that we have the appropriate means for those individuals to have their health care needs met. We owe it to them to do that. I'm engaging with senators now still. I've had several phone calls over the last week with different senators talking about different ideas I have in order to help improve the bill and to address the concerns of my constituents, and I'm going to continue to do that and see what might come out of the Senate. But I'm also separately working in a caucus that I'm a part of, the Problem Solvers Caucus, which is 20 Democrats and 20 Republicans, and identifying what solutions can we have in a bipartisan way to address these challenges, the individual market being one and the Medicaid expansion being two, and that work is ongoing as well.
As you have those conversations with Governor Ducey,
Yep.
and you talk about an off-ramp, a long, slow off-ramp
Yeah.
of getting some of the people who are on Medicaid to another option, are you talking about shifting those people to fully state-funded care? And if so, what is his reaction?
Well, I don't want to speak for Governor Ducey or publicize some of our discussions, but I would say overall, certainly there's a state level of wanting to manage some things more locally at the state level instead of federal bureaucrats coming up with one-size-fits-all solutions for a lot of different things. But what we need to make sure we don't do is shift responsibility to the state without shifting the resources and the flexibility to the state.
The U.S. Senate health care bill would leave almost 460,000 veterans without access to Medicaid. And the House bill also did that, just the numbers were lower. And the projected impact is that that's about 6,800 Arizona
Exactly.
veterans. You oppose the House health care bill. What would be, specifically in regard to veterans, the best way to maintain care for them as health care gets renegotiated?
That's the whole problem, that not knowing exactly what the outcome of this whole drama that we've been unfolding now for about 6-7 months is that here's a distinct population, about half a million veterans across the nation, 7,000 here in Arizona, that'll be directly impacted. Access to Medicaid would be eliminated. So we're talking about the expansion. We're talking about the subsidies provided to states for that expansion, eligibility for Medicaid, and when you're cutting almost $1 trillion from the Senate bill from Medicaid in order to pass that on as tax relief to the richest people in this country, who's going to be affected? Those are people say unintended consequences. They're consequences everybody knew about when this bill started. And how you fix it is that you leave those situations alone in terms of health reform, Medicaid expansion, eligibility requirements as we have now, and put as a priority that these constituencies are not going to be affected. Those are people in nursing homes, people that are having home health care, kids with disabilities, adults with disabilities, all part of the Medicaid expansion and part of Medicaid coverage, including veterans, would be very, very hard hit with no means to get the access. Saying go to the VA when they have chosen not to poses a problem.
But there's a fiscal impact to having them to keeping them on coverage, as there is for anybody. This costs states money, costs the federal government money to maintain that Medicaid. So that's the real point of reducing the cost for the federal government in these bills, is it not?
Well, that's the real point, but it's also possibly one of the biggest transfers of wealth too, because by the $1 trillion being cut from Medicaid over a 10-year period goes to the highest 2% in this country. That is, that to me is also a fairness issue. And is there fixes that are needed to Obamacare? Yes. Is there fixes that are needed to Medicaid to make it more efficient, cover more people, deal with cost increases? Absolutely. But that's not the discussion we're having. It's an either all or nothing discussion, and there's no common ground discussions going on now. So what happens? Those people then become consequences. And to solely look at healthcare as a cost reduction strategy, I think missing the point. And the point is that we have the costs that have been reduced in this country because of Obamacare are the cost to hospital providers from emergency room, the cost overall and the benefit of health care and less long-lasting issues, the pre-existing conditions, removing that. Those have been a burden to insurance companies. Those have been a burden to pharmaceutical companies in terms of trying to cap costs, but they have not been a burden to the patient who has been receiving this care. So if we're looking at reductions, the reductions can occur. We can buy prescriptions, Doug, as the VA does, as a whole, for everybody covered by Medicaid and Medicare. That would lower prescription drugs. We could have a public option that would compete, Medicare for all, that would compete with the private insurance companies and bring costs down and still provide.
I want to talk about feasibility. So if you could wipe the slate clean, all of the politics and discussion about healthcare, and start over, what are the elements of healthcare that could pass the House and the Senate and actually make some movement, since it seems stuck right now?
That's a difficult question, because there are probably 2 or 3 areas that are very, very in opposite trends. One is the provision of providing the broadest amount of accessible and affordable health care to the most Americans. And that involves Medicaid expansion. That involves Medicare for all strategies. That involves expanding the pool of people covered in this country. And revenue generation in terms of, one of the things that the Senate bill does is it takes away all the taxation on medical devices, on the high income earners, and the list goes on. And so what happens is that you shrink the revenue, you cut the programs that are already there. That is not really going to deal with deficit issues when the corresponding cost is going to have to be picked up by somebody. Healthcare is 1/6 of our economy. So we can't simply look at it as how much can we save out of Medicaid and how much can we cut Medicare. We have to look at it, the jobs that are involved here, the economics of it all, and that complexity, I think, if we look at it as 1/6 of our economy, that should be the common ground in which we look at affording and providing health care for the maximum number of Americans, and at the same time looking at the economic benefit from having that kind of a system. And we're not doing that.
Of course, another issue looming for the federal government with relevance to southern Arizona is the renegotiation of the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. I asked both border representatives what they would like to see in a new version.
Environmental protections that are enforceable, wage protections that are enforceable, and that giving and receiving countries in the process, that there's economic benefits to both sides. I wasn't a supporter of NAFTA 20 plus years ago. That's embedded in how we do business now. And so rooting it out and saying it's served its purpose is not going to deal with the economic reality of both Mexico and Canada, but more importantly, Mexico and the United States in this instance. So if we're renegotiating, let's put that working person first. Let's put job security right on top of that. Let's look at wages. Let's look at environmental protections and strategies to help us abate the whole climate change issue. If that was to be done again, and that's the open box to look at, and not just facilitating commerce, but also dealing on who it's affecting. An outcome like that, with strengthening those categories, would be something that I would really support.
You recently met with the Secretary of Commerce.
Yeah.
I'm assuming you talked a little bit about NAFTA.
We did.
If you were negotiating it today, what would you be looking for?
There's 9 members of Congress that represent southern border districts, and so I thought, we need to come together. We disagree on things from time to time, but there's things that we can agree upon that as southern border communities, we have equities and we have agreement on how important cross-border commerce is, and the things that we saw benefit our communities so far from the ability to increase trade and opportunities between us and Mexico, and we need to preserve those and we need to build on those. And I think us speaking as one voice would be important. So I organized this meeting. There were 6 Democrats and 3 Republicans that represent southern border communities, for us to be able to speak to him, to make sure that as he's listening to other communities around the country about what's good and bad with NAFTA and what they want changed, that he hears from southern border communities. So from our community, I wanted to make sure he understood that the cross-border economic opportunity, specifically in agriculture, has been one that's been important for our communities. The fresh produce that comes up through Mexico is creating jobs in our community, to be a hub for logistics, to then disperse that out throughout the nation. Then also our farmers and ranchers in Arizona exporting down to Mexico and to Canada is vitally important. So we've got to maintain the benefits that we've had so far, specifically in agriculture and opportunities for logistics and additional trade logistic infrastructure that we can have. But we need to modernize NAFTA to include e-commerce, intellectual property, energy sector. That's not so much an Arizona issue as it is Texas, but there's an opportunity to improve upon it while also preserving the gains that we've already had. So that was really our main message, was do no harm and make it only better. Mexico is Arizona's #1 trading partner. There's 100,000 jobs in Arizona created because of that cross-border commerce. We need to build on that opportunity as we go into those negotiations. And the Secretary heard us loud and clear.
Then there's the issue of safety. The recent shooting at a congressional baseball practice that severely injured House member Steve Scalise reminded many of January 8, 2011, when then Representative Gabrielle Giffords was shot at a constituent event in Northwest Tucson. Also this year, Congresswoman McSally received threats, and the suspect in those incidents is being prosecuted. I asked her if she feels safe.
We certainly have seen an increase in threats across the country, and obviously what happened to Steve Scalise and the other members that were out there and those that were hit is just atrocious. The fact that individuals would be taking acts of violence, and we are seeing the threats of violence, it's certainly increased. I do feel safe. Our local law enforcement here do an amazing job. TPD, Cochise County Sheriff's Office, and Pima County Sheriff's Office. When I'm out and about and doing things in the community that is in the public sphere, they're around and available, and I feel safe, when I'm in our community. In Washington, D.C., we have the Capitol Police doing an incredible job.
But they're not always with you guys.
They're not always with us. So I played on the congressional football team, I played on the softball team, and we are often in very similar circumstances that we saw the morning of the shooting with the baseball team, where we don't have the protection. They're taking a look at things that they can do to address some of those potential vulnerabilities. They're already increasing some funding to the Capitol Police to be able to support where there's more members of Congress together that may be publicized, so that we can address types of situations like that. Thank God Steve Scalise was at that practice that morning. The only reason the Capitol Police was there was because he has a detail. Had he had a media interview or some other meeting or something, he wouldn't have been there. And we would have been mourning the deaths of dozens of members of Congress and staff and others and children who were there. I mean, it would have been horrific. So I think the attentiveness is certainly higher on how we can address this. But I think the most important thing is that we can't live in a bunker. As representatives, we have to be out there in the community. I flew in combat. I put my life on the line for our country. I need to continue to be out and engaged and do my job. I don't want to take unnecessary risks, don't get me wrong, But the worst thing that we could do as, I think, a message to those who, might think this is a good idea for them to be the next one, to take action, is for us to then hide and not be engaging and representing and listening in our communities. We just celebrated the 4th of July. 241 years ago, our founding fathers came up with this amazing idea of this country that's based on freedom and opportunity and equality for everybody. And part of that foundation is a representative government. And so we need to lean into that, and we need to show that we're not afraid and that we are going to still be engaging in our communities while we take appropriate measures, with law enforcement to mitigate any risks that are out there.
Do you feel safe?
I do. And, that's not naive Pollyanna kind of an attitude. I mean, I understand that the risk factor for those of us in public life, and particularly in Congress, has gone up. I understand that. I understand that the political division in this country is sharper, deeper, and more antagonistic than it's ever been. And with it comes the threats, and with it comes an increased risk for people. But personally, I feel okay. I feel that, certainly from the cooperation from local Tucson Police Department or any other part of my district has been tremendous. Capitol Police, the other federal agencies have been very conscious and very supportive. But there's a root to all this that we have to get a handle on. The divisions that are being, we cannot continue to flame these divisions simply by the rhetoric we use and simply by the tone and tenor of our discussions. And I think those of us in elective office, as difficult as it might be even for me sometimes, to maybe bite your tongue in terms of a comment you make about a colleague or a situation or about Trump, some of that is necessary. The debate should be solely on the issues, and that's not occurring. It's become a highly personalized, it's become a how much damage can I do to someone else in 30 seconds? And that feeds a mentality. And I think that people now see their elected officials and a portion of this electorate sees them as their enemies and not necessarily their representative. And I think that's the stress. And the divisions have intensified. The hate crimes have intensified in this country over the last year, 9 months, all through the campaign now. And I think we have to be very conscious of how we use that rhetoric, when we use that rhetoric, and not make the whole thing about it's their fault versus us. It's a difficult situation, but I think members of Congress can help themselves and their constituents by introducing a level of civility and making the debate about content, not personalities. We're not doing that yet.
Now we'll move to topics each of the Southern Arizona representatives holds dear. For Congressman Grijalva, one of those issues is environmental protection. Just in the last 2 weeks, he has expressed concern that a border wall would threaten Mexican gray wolves and decried a water protection that was recently reversed. He has also sought to protect public lands. What can you get done on environmental policy in this administration and with a Republican majority?
One of the things that I'm trying to do with the leadership on the Democratic side is to make the environment, climate change, what's happening at EPA with the deregulating of basic protections around clean air and clean water and public health initiatives, to make that a front burner issue. I fundamentally believe that the vast majority of people in Arizona and in this country believe in conservation, that they believe that human beings are part of the big problem with climate change and part of the cause, that fossil fuel dependency is not taking us in the right direction, that building a wall is ludicrous at many levels, but it is also a negative environmental impact. So I want to place those, and that's been the effort that I've been carrying as ranking member of the Resources Committee, is to put it as a front burner issue in front of voters and in front of Americans, not as a back issue that we get to. Every time there's an election, if there's any collateral damage in terms of issues, it's about the environment. And I think we're horribly underestimating how people feel about that, and generationally how they feel that it's going to affect their kids. So I continue to push it as a priority issue, not just a side issue.
So you think there's common ground on that issue, but we really don't hear about it too much in the Republican platform. So how do you find that common ground if it's not a priority issue?
One of the keys to this change is I don't know if I'm going to ever have the wherewithal to turn Speaker Ryan around to accept this as a premise, or the Freedom Caucus in the House of Representatives, or the Republican majority, or McConnell and the Senate majority. It's about representative government affords us every 2 years an opportunity to change. And so I think the appeal so much right now, as it's been with healthcare, it's a good example, it's not so much how do I get Paul Ryan to change his mind? How do I get McConnell to change his mind? It is about bringing the force of that public opinion to bear on who's making those decisions. It's an electoral issue as much as anything else. So my effort is to rally public opinion to fundamentally change who's making the decisions.
One issue of high importance to Congresswoman McSally is military resources and readiness. In the past 2 weeks, she announced that her work on the defense budget bill helped get funding for the A-10 aircraft based at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, plus funding for the Army's Fort Huachuca in Sierra Vista, and for missiles manufactured by defense contractor Raytheon in Tucson.
Well, our military is in a very, very difficult place. We've been under this thing called the Budget Control Act, or sequestration, for a long time. We've had a 20% cut to our military over the last years at a time when the world has become far more dangerous than I've seen in my lifetime. And we are now really seeing the bleeding that's going on in our military. We've got the smallest size Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine since before World War II. We've got an equipment and readiness crisis that is like none other. We are ensuring that those who deploy are just in time ready to deploy, but it's at the expense of the readiness to go for any other types of contingencies that might happen. We agree, I think, across the political spectrum and in our community that if someone's going to raise their right hand and wear the uniform and we're going to ask them to go protect us, that we're not going to do that on the cheap. You know, that we're going to give them all the equipment and training and readiness and the best capability that they have in order to defend us. And they're in a pretty bad place right now. We've been listening to the service chiefs, the Secretary of Defense, and others, both in open hearings, but also behind closed doors in classified settings. And it's a pretty difficult situation. And over the last week, we were able to, in the annual markup of the defense bill and also the appropriations bill, provide additional resources to our troops across the board. For our local wins, they're pretty significant. And it's not just for local. This is important for our national security. This isn't like pork barrel politics. This is supporting the A-10, supporting the EC-130, supporting the Tomahawk missile and the Standard Missile-3 and the missions at Fort Huachuca to include the intelligence missions, the network missions, cybersecurity missions, unmanned aerial vehicle missions. These are all important missions for national security. And I was able to secure significant wins in all these areas in the defense bill.
So with the A-10, there was a federal decision to not supply some of the maintenance, and that would have put some of them out of service. Is that right?
So keep in mind, let's look at this over the last few years. The last administration was trying to get rid of the A-10 altogether. So my first fight when I got to Washington, D.C. was to stop that from happening. Keep the A-10 flying, keep it fully funded in operation and maintenance, and keep it until we have a proven tested replacement. That is all still in law. There is a prohibition for them to put one more A-10 into the boneyard. They're not allowed to do that. They're not allowed to even have the conversation about putting any A-10s to the boneyard until we have the fly-off competition between the F-35 and the A-10. We had those wins in the previous year's bills. So for this year, I was focused on the re-winging of about 110 A-10s in the fleet, that if they don't have their wings strengthened, they'll start not being able to fly starting in about a year and slowly through the course of the next years. Right now, if an airplane has been re-winged, then it can fly until 2040 and beyond. We're flying the A-10s much longer than they ever intended to, so there's just structural, mechanical things they need to do to strengthen and re-wing them.
So from a layman term,
Yeah.
that's like actually
Putting
new wings
yeah,
on?
it's actually strengthening, and yeah, I mean, it's not completely removing the wing and putting it on, but really it comes down to reinforcing and re-strengthening the wings so that they can structurally continue to fly. So there's 283 A-10s in the fleet. 173 have already gone through this process. There was a previous contract, but with the uncertainty and the last administration trying to get rid of the A-10, they let the contract lapse. So they said, the Air Force said they need $123 million in order to start the process up again. They're probably going to bid it out, see if they can, maybe get a lower price, and then have to start up a production line again for the new wings, and then to be installing them as aircraft go in for heavy maintenance. So we got the first $20 million in the omnibus bill for fiscal year 17, which is the one we're in right now, and we got the $103 million in the bill that we just passed out of our committee last week, both appropriations and armed services. So I feel good that we're going to be able to start this process now to strengthen those wings so that those other 110 aircraft can continue to fly into the future until we have a proven tested replacement.
That's it for us. Next week, Vanessa Barchfield will be here with a look at how local tribes are planning to deal with climate change. Thanks for watching.